Now the biggest question before everyone is what happens post the 17th of May? So it's very clear that there will be greater relaxation that will be allowed, and as people start getting back to work, there's a fear that there could be a big spike in the number of coronavirus cases. So the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy in the United States has come out with 3 scenarios about what could happen with the coronavirus contagion, not just post the 17th of May, but over the next several years. The researchers expect that the crisis is likely to stay for between 1.5 to 2 years. We'll have to deal with it. But the big question is, will it stay in small bouts, or will there be a big jump like there was in the 1918 influenza? In just a moment from now, we'll have 4 top epidemiologists joining us to discuss this. But before this, let me take you through what this research study shows and why it is so significant in determining what your life and mine will look like post the 17th of May. Take a look.
Governments world over are doing what they can. But scientists in America's Midwestern state of Minnesota have done some straight talk in their research. The coronavirus pandemic is here to stay on the planet for 18 to 24 months. The University of Minnesota's Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy specializes in drawing up worst-case scenario strategies.
Our job is not to scare people out of their wits. It's to scare them into their wits. We are the super planners, the worst-case scenario strategists, global leaders in the discipline of preparedness.
And experts here recommended that the world better prepare itself for what likely could be periodic resurgences of the disease over the next 2 years.
From a planning standpoint, we believe that the only one that we must absolutely plan for as the priority one is the big peak. If you plan for that one, you'll have handled all the rest of them. If you don't plan for that one and it happens, it'll be hell.
Experts studied pandemic influenza outbreaks in the past 100 years to assess the longevity of COVID-19 and came out with 3 possible scenarios for COVID-19. Scenario 1 projects that the first peak is followed by a series of repetitive smaller waves for over a 1 to 2 year period. The toughest of the 3 scenarios predicts a second and much larger wave in the fall or winter of 2020. And then 1 or more smaller subsequent waves next year. This situation is similar to what the world witnessed in influenza pandemics in the past century. The least likely scenario projects that the first outbreak is followed by a slow burn of the ongoing transmission. No subsequent waves really follow. Cases and deaths may continue to occur. The study found seasons, winter or summer, did not have much effect on past pandemics. Most of them had an early peak, followed by a second substantial outbreak roughly 6 months later. Adequate protection for healthcare workers during and identifying trigger points over the next 2 years hold the key. With Ankit Kumar, Bureau Report, India Today.
So broadly, the researchers are suggesting there could be 3 scenarios. I want to recap those 3 scenarios as I introduce our guests who are joining us on this broadcast. I want to welcome first Professor Mark Lipsitch. He is the Professor of Epidemiology in the Department of Epidemiology at Harvard's T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Also joining us from the Harvard Health Institute is Dr. Ashish Jha, Director of the Harvard Medical Center. Professor Bama Mukherjee is the Professor of Epidemiology and Chair of Biostatistics at the University of Michigan. Dr. Giridhar Babu has been doing a lot of very serious epidemiological modeling in India. He is the Head of Epidemiology at the Public Health Foundation of India. So 4 very serious experts joining us on this broadcast. I want to explain what the 3 scenarios put out by the researchers at the University of Minnesota are. And remember, this applies to all countries. Now, depending on how we act, we'll see which of these scenarios play out. So the first scenario is a peak and valley, which means that we've seen a bit of a peak in countries like the United States, Italy, Spain. So there already has been a peak. The infection goes down, and then a couple of months later, there is another peak. It's not as high as the first one, but there's a peak. So this business of a peak and valley continues till all through of the next year. So it could go out for about a year, year and a half. This is scenario number one, the peaks and valleys scenario. Scenario number two is what happened in the Spanish influenza of 1918. And that's the scenario where you already had one wave of infection in the summer of this year, then it goes down. But in the winters, it comes back with a vengeance, and that peak is much bigger than the first peak. And that is problematic because this is the peak that does the maximum devastation, and it's an extended peak, so it's a slow decline then. It doesn't go up again as much, but that big peak in the winter of this year could potentially do a lot of damage. So that's scenario two, which is the fall peak. There are smaller peaks later, but not as big as the winter peak, and that's problematic. Scenario three is the slow burn peak. So you have one big peak right now, which has happened. In some countries, hasn't mercifully happened in India so far, but you have a big peak, and then you have a few small waves, and it keeps going on till the time everybody gets vaccinated, till the time herd immunity, and herd immunity is defined as 55% of the population gets the virus. So those are the three peaks, those are the three scenarios the researchers are looking at. I want to first get in word from the outside, and I'll go across to Dr. Ashish Jha. Dr. Jha, what are you making of these three scenarios, the modeling that's been done, and what do you think India needs to do so as to ensure that scenario number two, which seems most problematic, where there's a big winter peak, that we can avoid that, sir? Welcome.
Thank you, Rahul, for having me back. Yeah, so look, CIDRAP, this group that has done this in Minnesota, is really one of the best modeling experts in the world. And so their scenarios are all, I think, very realistic. And no one knows for sure how this virus is going to play out. What we do know for sure is that it will be with us for a long time, certainly until we have an effective vaccine that's widely deployed. And so the big question for Indian policymakers is, how do we get through this time period safely? And, you know, we've talked about this. The strategies are really very straightforward. Maintaining as much social distancing as we can. Lockdown has been very expensive, especially for the poor people of India. So I think long extended lockdowns are going to be very, very hard to sustain. And then beyond that, a surveillance system that uses testing, that uses symptoms, to try to isolate people when they get infected is going to be absolutely critical. There is no other magic here. There is distancing, there is testing, there's surveillance. And if India, and then of course, making sure the health system is in good shape in terms of having adequate protections. If India can really focus on just those things, it will optimize the chances that it can get through no matter which of the three scenarios play out.
Mark Lippitt, you are amongst the professors who worked on putting together this model that Ashish Jha and others are speaking so highly about. We've been reading your study with great interest. You're saying that three likely scenarios which are going to play out. How is it that that's decided that which of these scenarios is most likely to play out? So how do we know which of these scenarios we'll have to deal with and why?
Well, I don't think that's the right way to look at it. I think every one of those three scenarios that we describe is going to play out in different parts of the world. And the main determinant, apart from some local factors in transmission, is going to be the policies adopted by governments. So those governments which maintain tight control will have small waves, and those which allow more transmission will have larger waves.
Now try and put this in context for us, because a lot of people who are watching have been locked down for almost 50 days now, and they're itching to get out. They're saying, okay, if this virus is going to be around, then we may as well just deal with it. How do we ensure that we don't end up in scenario number two, which is the one that leads to a big jump in November?
Yeah, I think it's a very hard balance for every government, and every government is struggling with it, to balance the need for continued economic activity to allow people to feed themselves and provide basic necessities while controlling the spread of the virus. It seems that India has so far been spared the worst kinds of stress on the healthcare system. And so it may be that India has more room to permit spread, but it's really a challenging balance that every government is trying to find.
Dr. Jha, I'm not certain about this because you and Bramar understand the situation in India very closely. You can say that at this moment we've got unused capacity, that the medical system has been bolstered to some extent, and that we can allow for the virus to spread. But my fear is, given the limited capacity, given the extent of our population, if things start slipping out of control, they could slip out of control very fast. So, what do you think would be the best strategy post the 17th of May?
Yeah, so Rahul, I agree with Mark that there aren't easy answers here. And for India, the only other strategy, if you can't stay in lockdown forever, which we can't, after May 17th, and of course there are green zones that are already starting to open up, the only other way to control the virus that we know of outside of lockdown is maintain some amount of social distancing. So no large gatherings at all until this virus is done. No large melas, no big events, but also really having a very aggressive testing program. I know that this is an old topic we've brought up many times, but testing, tracing, isolation is the other element of this that can be very helpful. Unto itself, it won't be enough. But between that, some amount of social distancing, I think it's going to be critical. I don't know that there is a magical third option out there for India, and large outbreaks can be very, very costly in terms of lives lost. So we have to try to avoid that.
You know, the one team that's doing a lot of very serious modeling in India is the team led by Professor Giridhar Babu at the Public Health Foundation of India. Dr. Babu, we are hearing what the researchers in the United States are saying. What is your modeling telling you? What are the various scenarios you envision post the 17th of May? What do you think is the best strategy going forward?
I think I overall agree with the principles in which both Dr. Mark and Dr. Ashish are explaining in terms of how the scenarios can spread out all over the world. But for India, I think we should stop discussing at the level of the country and then start discussing only at the level of states and sub-states. So as your graphs showed earlier, Rahul, the case fatality rate is highest in West Bengal, followed by Meghalaya, Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh, Himachal Pradesh, and Maharashtra. So the first thing as an epidemiologist or any public health person I would do is, how would we focus on reducing the mortality in these states which have higher? So that's my first question. Second, this artificial nomenclature of red, orange, and green, the virus does not know boundaries. And in the last 2 weeks, more than 60 districts who are green have become red. So maintaining this kind of nomenclature will only mean that we are diverting our resources to only one segment, which is not the right thing to do. And as people are describing about increasing testing, the test positivity is also going down in most of these states, which means that we are not testing the right people. We are simply testing and simply increasing the numbers.
No, so can I draw you into specifics? You're saying orange, green, red makes no sense. Okay, I hear you. What do you think should be done? So let's assume there's Mumbai. Let's assume there's Delhi. What is the strategy you are advocating, Professor?
So I was going to the next. So what we should do is a strategy on which India is very strong of looking for syndrome-based approach, coupling with the kind of testing that we do. So for example, Tamil Nadu has increased testing, but their test positivity is also higher. Kerala has increased testing and also test positivity higher. So we need to be looking at whom are we testing, number one. Number two, every district in this country should be the unit on which we will do the analysis on, not just red or blue or green or whatever the colors, because the virus does not know colors or boundaries. Every district should have a minimum expected number that we want to see, and if we don't get it, that should become red. Currently, we are doing the reverse. So if no cases means it is the most priority for me as a public health person, because we might be missing the transmission there. So the strengthening surveillance, adding testing on top of that will get us to identify the areas of transmission.
One second. But you're saying this in the future? Here's the situation that we're dealing with at this moment. Are we prepared in your view, Professor Babu? You can't just magically create tests. We've bolstered capacity to some extent, but I was looking at a story put out by the Data Intelligence Unit. We have amongst the lowest testing per million in the world.
Rahul, even the testing averages are pulled by those states which have done well compared to the states who have not done well. So looking at averages at national level is not going to help. You asked about how do we fix it now? And here is how. If we start reviewing these indicators, there are only two things that we need to review. Whether all the districts are reporting enough SARI cases, whether all the districts are reporting ILI cases, influenza-like illness. If yes, are we testing them or not? By starting from there and then tracing their contacts, we will be almost certain that we will be limiting the areas of transmission to very few areas. Yes, it will increase the number of cases, but that's what we want. We want to increase the number of cases to identify the areas of transmission so that we reduce the mortality. That's why I said reducing the deaths associated with should be the only goal as we move forward from lifting lockdown onwards.
So it's interesting when you hear a professor speak, he says cases going up is good because it shows that you're testing properly. Anybody else would freak out if cases start going up. So it's a very different way that the experts are looking at it. Professor Brahma Mukherjee, I was seeing a lot of the work that you're doing at the University of Michigan over the weekend, and I'm very curious to know, in the light of what's being recommended by Professor Jha, Professor Babu, what's your sense of what should India's strategy be, which is what chief ministers and the Prime Minister are discussing at this moment. From your perspective, from a disease control perspective, what should we be doing from here on?
So I completely agree with Professor Lipschitz, Professor Jha and Professor Babu that testing is the key. So India so far, and I'm happy to see that there has been progress. So over the last few weeks, consistently, India has increased the number of tests. In the last week, doing about 80,000 tests. But still, it is 0.1% of the population that India has tested. Compared to Iceland, it has tested 15.6% of its population. So for India to get to 1% of its population, it will need another 12 million tests. So we are not going to go there very quickly. So we have to really think about the syndromic surveillance.
First you all tell us that testing is key. Then you all tell us that the tests are unreliable. And then that makes no sense.
So I think that if you have seen, you don't have to actually believe us. You have to look at the natural experiments going all across the world in terms of that, yes, the tests do have 15% false negative. But the countries which have been successful have tested extensively. But if it's not possible, then you still need to do syndromic surveillance, as Dr. Babu mentioned, as well as do some amount of random testing in disease-free areas as well, not just hotspots, because you cannot fight this war blindfolded. You have to know data. And in any kind of models, 3 types, 4 types will need good data. And unless you test, you are not going to track the pulse of this epidemic. And you cannot fight an enemy blindfolded. Look at South Korea. They did tremendous testing, so as soon as, and they had few single-digit cases, but in the last few days, they have seen a spike. But they know what form of suppression and what form is working for them. So I'm sure they are going to nip it in the bud and curb this research. But if I had no idea, these 35 cases, these 85 new cases are going to explode. So we really need to track the outbreak threshold regardless of zones. Of course, we need to do intensification, prioritization with a given number of tests, coming up with a intelligent testing so that you can track the pulse of the epidemic, not just in hotspots, but also in other unsuspected areas.
Now, Dr. Jha, one of the things that the Delhi Chief Minister said in his intervention just a short while ago was that let's keep a lockdown only in the containment zone. So where there's a massive spread of the disease, just restrict the lockdown to that. Don't go district by district or city by city. That makes no sense. Open up other parts. If there's a containment area which you need to block out, just have a lockdown there. Do you think that could be a feasible strategy in our major metropolitans going forward, Dr. Jha?
I think it's going to be very hard to pull off, Rahul. Like, I understand the idea behind it, and it seems very tempting. But in order to be sure, you've got to, first of all, make sure people are not traveling from one zone to another. And I don't know exactly how you do that. Second is you have to be very confident that the places that don't look like they have a big outbreak, you really know for sure, and you've got to have extensive testing to be confident. So if you can do all of that, it might be a possible strategy. But for me, it feels very risky, and there's a good chance that you're not going to be able to contain it, and you're going to see much bigger outbreaks if you try to go district by district like that.
So then what should we do? Because that intuitively seems like a good idea. Most people watching would say, okay, if you can restrict the lockdown to those areas where there's a big spread, let other people get back to life. That's like a reasonable solution, reasonable way forward. You're saying that that could create an even bigger surge in infection. So then how do we deal with this? Because you've already seen, because I know we've got 4 doctors on this broadcast, but there's also, sir, the economic aspect to the lockdown. The Indian economy could potentially be in negative for the whole year. That's the emerging consensus. And there are people who are dying. They're saying, forget what the virus will do to us. We'll die of hunger. You can't ignore that reality as well, Dr. Jha.
Yeah, let me just be very clear. I am not saying we have to extend the lockdown forever. I am not saying you can't take a district by district approach. I am saying if you're going to do it, you have to know a couple of things. First, it's really helpful to have data. And so it's really helpful when you are saying, I'm going to open up a certain district because it doesn't look like it has many cases. It is very important that you know for sure it doesn't have many cases. And the only way you can do that is through syndromic surveillance and through testing. So I'm not suggesting that we don't take a data-driven district-by-district approach. I'm saying it's going to be difficult, and you're going to have to be data-driven and make sure that you're not blind here, and the lack of testing isn't driving you to make decisions, that you really know what places are the hot spots and what places are not.
One of the things that Professor Lipsitch talks about in his study is that herd immunity is the key. That 55% of the population, that's the benchmark in their study. When they contract the virus, then you've arrived at herd immunity. After that, according to them, the graph goes down. So, Professor Lipsitch, how much time will it take for a country like India to arrive at that 55% number to achieve herd immunity?
I think if it's controlled to any significant degree, we're talking many months and possibly more than a year. And that's why we laid out these long-term scenarios, because the only way to get herd immunity quickly, if herd immunity works, and we still don't really understand immunity, but it probably will be somewhat protective, the only way to get to a lot of people infected is to get them the only way to end it quickly is to have a lot of people infected quickly, and that will take a toll because the healthcare system will struggle to keep up, and because if we can push the epidemic into the future, then we will have better ways of treating it and hopefully better ways of preventing it. So that's the trade-off.
But one of the things that's happened in past influenzas is that the virus mutated, and as a result of which the next wave was stronger, and then you didn't really get immunity because then you were dealing with a different kind of virus, and that, Professor Mukherjee, seems to be a big problem. If this is the big idea that we get herd immunity, and then when we speak to doctors, they say, you know, as of now the virus genome seems stable, but we're not certain about what might happen in the future. It should not mutate, but it could mutate. There are just so many ifs and buts that how do you draw a strategy, how do you plan what happens with so many moving parts? Google and Facebook announced recently that till November, December, people shouldn't really come back to office. They should keep working from home. Because when people were watching Dr. Jha, Dr. Babu, all of you speak, they thought, okay, we're dealing with this lockdown for 40, 50 days. After that, life will start returning to normal. Now we're being told that at least till the end of the year, the situation could roughly stay as same. And even if you go out, it's at great risk to your life and limb.
So the lockdown was never advised as a strategy. The lockdown was really to buy time so that we know when we reopen after lockdown, we have an exit strategy. So this is a really hard problem, and we cannot deny that there is a lot of unknowns here. So we cannot be afraid of the unknown, but we have to also take comfort in knowledge being generated at a very rapid pace. But success is tenuous here. We really have to understand that. And I am not recommending extending the lockdown as a strategy, but we will have to learn to live like this, balancing between probably less than suboptimal mitigation, but also reactivating the workforce, because people are living, as you mentioned, in penury and devastation. So you need a holistic model, and the epidemiologic models are only giving a component of it. Policymakers need these numbers to understand whether the hospital capacity is going to be overwhelmed or not. Nobody is recommending living in lockdown endlessly. That cannot be a solution.
Dr. Babu, if the lockdown was to buy us time to ramp up capacity, in your view, have we used that lockdown well? Have we used this time well, sir?
Rahul, I wish I knew the answer for every state. So from what I know, we are in a condition where some states are very well prepared, some states are moderately prepared, and some states are under prepared. So how do you change
Build
this?
on that. One second. Let's get more specific. Which states seem most unprepared to you?
So if you can see where in terms of the case fatality rate increasing, and even in terms of how the epidemic is just shaping up in the ascending phase, these are the states roughly which I say around the Tropic of Cancer. It starts from West Bengal. You have also in Gujarat, where the ascending phase you are seeing. You also have in the Madhya Pradesh, and Uttar Pradesh has come down. So in these states, I think right now what we need to do is assess preparedness and see how well we can contain, and then probably
these are states you're saying are not well prepared, sir?
Yes.
Which are the states that are well prepared?
So all the southern Indian states, the state of Himachal Pradesh, and also Delhi and Mumbai to an extent, although it seems counterintuitive. Mumbai has done their best in terms of testing, and if you see in terms of positivity also, they are very good. So, and also more people have infected, so they have also done well, relatively well compared to the other states.
Dr. Jha, there are some parallels being drawn in concern in Mumbai, that can Mumbai have to deal with what New York dealt with? There's a huge amount of population living in a very tightly packed area. How do we ensure, can we still ensure that Mumbai doesn't go down the New York route, or is it too late? What can be done at this moment?
Yeah, so we've seen this now in major metropolitan areas, and New York was really among the most devastating in the world in terms of number of cases. I think any place where you have a very tightly packed population and a large outbreak, the only thing that we think can work is a very substantial social distancing, essentially a very large lockdown until you can bring that virus outbreak under control. So I think that's what Mumbai has to pursue in the short run. Until we see the number of cases really flattening and going down, there is no alternative. And again, testing can be a part of that. But once you get a big outbreak in a large city, a very dense city like Mumbai or New York, you don't have very many other choices.
No, but there is a problem there, Dr. Jha. It's one thing to recommend that let everybody be isolated, but you're from India. You realize the reality of places like Dharavi in Mumbai, where people stay 8 to 10 in a very small cubby hole. Now, how do you tell them to distance from each other? And they've built some stadia, which is good, in the racecourse parking lot, in some big open grounds. They've built some capacities, but given the number of people who are staying in places like Dharavi and the capacity that's been built, there's really no match.
Yeah, look, I think we have to be realistic about what we can do. And I'm not suggesting that everybody leave their homes and go live by themselves. And obviously that is neither realistic nor possible. What I am saying is if with really good data, we can track how big the outbreak is in Mumbai, we can measure what's happening. We have to put in whatever policies we can keep to keep economic activity and really just kind of interactions among people to a minimum. We will have to basically accept some amount of inter-household transmission. I don't think we can do anything about that. But until the outbreak gets under control, it's hard for me to see how we can realistically let life go back to normal or anything even close to normal in a place like Mumbai. So I think we have to make some sort of a trade-off here. I'm not saying there's an easy solution out of this.
Professor Lippitt, before I let you go, if you go back in time, look at all the pandemics that mankind has had to deal with, which pandemic does this virus represent the most closely, and what are the lessons that we could learn from the way we dealt with that pandemic?
It has many similarities to the 1918 pandemic flu. It's fortunately not quite as deadly, especially to young people, as that one was. But it is similarly global. It is similarly taking very obvious numbers of lives that are visible just by looking at total deaths and how much higher they are than they should be for the given time of year. And that was really one of the landmarks of 1918. And it's taking a long time to play out, as with 1918. Because the population is highly susceptible, and it takes a while, especially with control, to spread throughout the population. So I think that's the closest parallel. It's not exactly the same. It's a different virus. We may have some treatments, and we certainly have much better healthcare system, which is part of the paradox that we're making all these efforts in part to protect a healthcare system that would have been less of a priority then, because we didn't have such a healthcare system. But now that we have it, we want to protect it because we depend on it for many things.
Dr. Jha, we're looking at it inside out from an Indian perspective, but if you were to zoom out and give us a helicopter shot view of how you think India has done relative to other countries. You're in the United States. If you compare with the US, compared to other countries, given our capacities, how are we doing as a country and as a people, sir?
Yeah, so I think the U.S. is not the right comparison, because the U.S. approach and the U.S. response has been, I think, relatively quite mediocre. India has taken a very different approach than most other countries, right? So you had the countries in East Asia that did the very aggressive testing, tracing, isolation early, and they have largely avoided lockdowns, not completely, but mostly. Western Europe has sort of tried to ignore the virus initially, really got into a lot of trouble, Western Europe and the United States. India locked down early and has had relatively few cases, but now has been in lockdown for quite a long time. And the cost of that lockdown is becoming very apparent. So India, the key, as I think one of the other speakers said, the point of a lockdown is to buy time so you can be prepared for dealing with the virus as lockdown comes to an end. I think India has done a good job of keeping the number of cases low, but now the challenge really begins as the economy begins to open up, is how do you keep enough social distancing in place to stop massive outbreaks? How do you have enough testing and surveillance to again manage the disease? The real test of Indian performance will come, I think, in the weeks and months ahead, though I would say so far it has done a pretty good job of keeping the disease from getting out of control.
Okay, you know, this is, if we were students and you were professors, I'd say first you say week 1 of the lockdown is really important, then you say week 2 of the lockdown is really important, then you say week 3, now we're at a crucial juncture, and now Dr. Jha is saying what happens from here is crucial. So basically it's all very, very complex, and we have to be on our guard all the time. We didn't get anything which would give us great relief, but we got as well informed a perspective as is possible about how leading doctors are looking at where we are at and what we need to do next. Professor Ashish Jha, Professor Mark Lipsitch, Professor Brahma Mukherjee and Dr. Giridhar Babu for joining us with your very deep insights. Thank you very much. I wish we had more relief. I wish, like a report card, you could give us better news which we could take back, but at least we have some very hard reality and we understand what to make of where we are at. Thank you so much. Hello everyone, this is Rahul Kanwal here. Hope you enjoyed this video. For the latest news and analysis, like and subscribe the India Today YouTube channel, and don't forget to press the bell icon to stay updated.